Stop because the 15 minutes was up. Into the Deep, Chapter 3, Part 2. I also needed an outlet to burn off my excess energy, and I figured that rebuilding a house room by room would do the trick. I did all the plumbing, wiring, drywalling. I knocked down walls and busted up an old foundation that was once a milking barn. I planted fruit trees to provide inexpensive food. Through it all, I developed a very disciplined ritual. I'd go up to the study I had built over the kitchen and read academic articles for 45 minutes. Then I'd reward myself with 15 minutes of work on the house, maybe smashing something with a sledgehammer. The key was to strictly limit my break time and get back to reading. I liked this pattern of mental, physical, which I maintain to this day. I was working so hard just trying to make ends meet that I had little time for social life. I didn't get to dive with my Sea Rover buddies much once we moved to Hatchville. The only friends I had were my work colleagues. It didn't help that Woods Hole was a small, insular community dominated by academics. Even the spouses tended to be highly educated. Margie had not gone to college, and I could tell that the intellectual atmosphere intimidated her. She didn't feel comfortable socializing with those couples. I had never been around so many professional women myself. My mother, smart as she was, had been a housewife and stayed home with the kids, as most mothers did in those days. I began to realize that my brother and I had both opted to marry housewives, like our mother. Marjorie's discomfort with the Woods Hole crowd was a little disconcerting, but I had so much else to do I didn't stop to think about it, and Margie was making friends on her own with some of the local residents. My PhD research took me out on surface vessels into the Gulf of Maine, a basin created by the continental plates pulled apart. My goal was to create a 3D image of how buried terrain, collecting data to document My goal was to create a 3D image of this now buried terrain, collecting data to document the theory of plate tectonics. I blasted a compressed air gun every 20 seconds to penetrate the seabed, creating images of the hidden structures beneath it as the shock waves bounced back to the surface. The constant discharges were annoying, especially for anyone trying to sleep. One crew member lost it and came at me with a knife. Who thought science could be such a violent pursuit? I also was applying for federal grants to equip Alvin with more tools. A little white sub was in dry dock when I started my research. It had flooded and sunk when cables broke during a launch, and it was being refurbished. Land geologists jump into their jeeps to climb the sides of volcanoes or zip out into the plains. I'm a field geologist too, just an undersea one, and I wanted to convert Alvin into my own jeep, something I could jump into and drive along the ocean bottom, banging on the rocks and retrieving samples that could help sort out the geology of the seabed. I wanted to add a diamond bit drill to extract rock specimens, and I needed acoustic transponders that I could drop into the water to track Alvin's movements more precisely. Improvements like these would provide better data and allow other scientists to verify Alvin's discoveries. Sure enough, with new equipment and a revitalized Alvin, I started getting interesting results. Once I had brought up rock from the floor of the Gulf of Maine, I studied their rate of radioactive decay, which allowed me to date them back to about 180 million years ago, to the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean. These findings helped support plate tectonics theory and showed the kind of science my little undersea field jeep could do. In 1971, Xavier Lapinchon, the marine geophysicist at CNEXO, the National Center for Exploration of the Oceans, a French government organization, wrote to Dr. Emery that his team wanted to dive in the Rift Valley of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, part of the longest mountain range on Earth. It runs south to north down the middle of the Atlantic, from the Arctic to southern Africa, almost all underwater. Their goal was to map a 60 square mile area about 400 miles southwest of the Azores that was thought to be a spreading center between two tectonic plates. Did we think, he asked, that submersibles could do a better job of mapping the region than sonar vehicles and other devices towed by surface ships? And could that provide further support for the plate tectonic theory? In my mind, the French were interested in the technology transfer. Woods Hole was the juggernaut in deep submersibles. We had Alvin, and we were developing new tracking technologies. The French wanted that knowledge. But we also wanted to learn about the geology of the ridge, and I realized that an expedition like this could be my big breakthrough. Emory asked me to draft a reply expressing support. Jim Heistler, the chairman of Woods Hole's Geophysics and Geology Department, took the lead, telling me to prepare a presentation on Alvin's capabilities for a meeting at Princeton in January of '72. The giants of earth science from all over the world would be there. If all went well, the National Science Foundation would join the French in funding the project. The oceanography geophysicists are considered big thinkers, but they had only used sensors towed behind surface ships to map the ocean floor and determine its magnetic structure. No one had gone down to the seabed and actually seen the fresh lava flows that come out of the Earth's interior, forming new crusts where plates were separating. The mega thinkers needed observational scientists like me to ground their theories in fact. Here I was, just a graduate student, the only Mister in the group, invited to give a presentation on how I was using Alvin to gather these kinds of observations. I was down in one of Princeton's lecture pits, looking up into the heavens filled with titans, and many of them were not too friendly. It was like Daniel going into the pit with the lions. My knees buckled, but I gave my talk. When I finished, Frank Press, the geophysicist from MIT and later the science advisor to President Jimmy Carter, asked with disdain what significant piece of science submersibles had ever accomplished. Everyone in the room stared down at me as my mind scrambled. What could I say? Alvin hadn't done much science yet. Then Bruce Ludendijk, a young upstart geophysicist with the Scripps doctorate who was working at Woods Hole, stood up. He was a cocky guy, and I love him to this day. He looked straight at Press and told him not to blame that on the submersibles. The scientific community had never tried to use them that deep down. At dinner that evening, I sat across from Maurice Ewing, the founder of Columbia's Lamont Doheny Earth Observatory. He'd had a few drinks, and he wagged his finger at me, and he said he might support the project, but added, "If you fail, we'll melt that submarine down into titanium paper clips." He really threw down the gauntlet. My competitive instincts kicked in. We're going to do it, I thought. The Academy agreed, and the French-American mid-ocean undersea study known as FAMOUS came to being. Preparing for Project FAMOUS required a huge shift from my dissertation research. I was jumping off the continental margin and into the deep ocean. I wasn't trained in deep sea science, but I was excited. Once they let us enter the Great Rift in our tiny submersibles, I thought, how could we miss? We'd be the first kids on the block, the first people to dive down into this world and see the crust forming and collect pieces of Earth's new skin. The plan was for the French to lead the show in '73 in their bathysphere Archimedes. Given my experience with Alvin, I would be the only American to go with them. Then I would go out again the following year with the rest of the American team and Alvin, which was being outfitted with new titanium hull that would double its diving depth to 12,000 feet, 3,000 feet beyond what we needed to reach the valley. Besides the science, the wonderful thing for me about being picked to work with the French is that I got to travel overseas. I went to France for planning meetings, and I became good friends with Jean Franchiatou, one of the scientists, and Jean-Louis Michel, Michel, an engineer. Franchot had gotten his PhD at Scripps, where he had met his wife, Marta, a lovely American. He and I really hit it off. He was an earthy, handsome guy with curly hair and a great laugh. A man's man in a French envelope. He was also absolutely brilliant. He and Marta were living in an old farmhouse in Brest, far western France, where the French government had an oceanographic center. I stayed there with them, and Jean introduced me to escargot and cheeses and pâtés, fine French cuisine, all of it. I would walk with Jean to his office, and he'd forage for mushrooms along the way. He got me ready for living abroad aboard the French research vessel. I grew up on meat and potatoes, but when you were in a French ship, they served you tongue and stomach linings, and it was eat or starve. And so the summer of '73 found me at sea, hovering over the mid-Atlantic ridge, as Le Pichon led the first dive in the bathysphere Archimedes, an older type of submersible. It dwarfed Darwin in size, but it was far less maneuverable. It just went down and up like a freight elevator. I watched the project leader complete the first day's work, knowing it would be my turn to go down the next day. I felt miserable when I woke up that August morning. I had been fighting a fever and strep throat, but I wasn't going to bail on this opportunity. I gargled warm salt water and prepared to dive. 3 of us climbed into Archimedes. My companions were a French naval officer and a French engineer. Their broken English was infinitely better than my French, which didn't go much beyond bonjour. The bathysphere floated thanks to a huge tank full of aviation fuel, which is lighter than water, and it descended by flooding its air tanks with seawater and releasing some of the gas. Down we went. It took 90 minutes to reach the seabed, and when we got there, the view was amazing. My eyes took it all in. Lava solidified into black, glass-like shapes, ran systematically in both directions along the central axis of the Rift Valley. The landscape was made up of relatively new crust. You couldn't miss it. All the controversy about plate tectonics evaporated just like that. The confirmation was right outside our viewport. We maneuvered slowly and grabbed a rock sample with Archimedes' claw. Then something odd happened. The vehicle's nose suddenly tilted down, and the next thing I knew, we were rising at top speed. I looked at the instrument panel. The needle on the amp meter had fallen. We had an electrical power failure, I thought, and it must have caused the electromagnetics in the ballast tanks to release some of the heavy steel shot that Archimedes normally discharged when it was ready to float back to the surface. As we shot up, I heard the last thing you want to hear in a situation, "Afu! Fire!" At the same moment, I smelled smoke. My companion called up to the surface, speaking in fast French. We turned off the oxygen inside the sphere and grabbed our individual oxygen masks. But even with my mask, I was getting dizzy. Maybe I was hyperventilating, I thought. I started to concentrate on my breathing, hard as it was with my swollen throat. I skipped breaths to lower my oxygen levels, but my head wasn't clearing, and I was getting dizzier. Maybe there's something wrong with my breathing apparatus, I thought, and I began to pull it off to inspect it. Thinking I was panicking, my French companion pushed it back down, and we struggled for a few moments. Then I saw realization dawn on the pilot's eyes. "Pardon, Bob," he said, reaching up to turn the valve that started the flow of oxygen. That was one of his jobs in an emergency. In the midst of their panic, he hadn't done it, and I hadn't thought about it myself. I was fine after that, but every time I saw him, he would reach up and go, "Pardon, Bob," and pretend to turn my oxygen. I didn't think it was funny. All told, French made 7 dives to Archimedes during that. When I returned home, I hunkered down for the final 10 months push to write my dissertation, The Nature of the Transcontinental Drift. My oral defense was another tense moment, but it paid off. I had my PhD in hand.